tonight. I'm very excited for tonight's program, Transgender Jews and Halakha. I'll introduce each of the guests as we get started, but first a few words from Rabbi Roly.
Thank you. Thank you, Abi, for putting this together, this great panel. Len has been a member, Rabbi Len Sharzer, doctor first, then Rabbi. It's really great to hear from both of you, and Michael Faccini as well. I just want to very briefly put this in the context of our own community, of the VJ community. I have to say with a great deal of pride that our community was on the forefront of gay rights back in the 80s. And it was at the time of the height of the AIDS epidemic. And our community took a very principled and strong stance in support. At the time was gay and lesbian rights. It was only GL, then came all the other letters as the Jewish community and the community in general discovered that there were a lot of people there who had been denied their rights, who needed inclusion and recognition. But we did our part, I think, to open the door within the Jewish community for fuller inclusion. But of course, the work is never done, and there's always more to do, and there's always more to include, and there's more doors to open. And so the work continues. Today, we know that we find ourselves in a critical moment, in a very painful and difficult moment, just as much as there are victories in justice issues all around us, now including, I mean, there's an awakening about Black Lives Matter. But at the same time, there's a pedaling back on the rights of many people, including and particularly of transgender people, taking back protections and rights, particularly with healthcare. Transgender people are being murdered. We had just a couple of weeks ago the murder of two trans individuals. So things are horrible, and that's the context in which we live, and that's why we have to be alert, not only alert and vigilant, but also active. And since we are a part of the Jewish community, the work begins inside, within our own community, within our own home. And so on this month of Pride Month, it's important that we learn and understand and recommit ourselves to all the work that remains ahead of us. Abi, are you going to introduce Michael, or?
Sure, yeah, so thanks so much, Roly. I'm very excited tonight to introduce one of my fellow rabbinical students at JTS, Michael Faccini. Prior to starting rabbinical school at JTS, Michael trained as a social worker at Washington University and served as a crisis intervention clinician and mental health care manager for the Jewish community. Throughout his college and graduate experiences, Michael has been involved in trans advocacy, peer support, and allyship training. He is proudest of his collaboration with his home shul, Kol Rina congregation in St. Louis, around trans inclusion and their continued growth after he moved to New York. Michael intends to serve as a congregational rabbi and to develop queer theology based on the idea of a God that is both all genders and none at all. So we're very excited to have you here, Michael. I'll say that Michael presented on the sort of history of transgender rights and halakha, trans Jews and halakha, in one of my classes this past semester, and I was so impressed with the way that he spoke about the history and spoke about the way that it really personally impacts him and the trans community, that I thought it would be great to share it with the rest of BJ. So with that, and a little bit about how the night's going to work, we're going to hear first from Michael. We'll hear a presentation And then I will invite Rabbi Sharzer to join the conversation. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A from the community. So with that, go ahead and take it away, Michael.
Okay. So, as with many queer things, the official history of trans Jews and halakha in the conservative movement is very recent. So really before 2003, there wasn't a lot of formal work around it. Prior to that, really the status was, you are never your affirmed gender. So in 2003, we have this teshuvah, this responsa, written by Rabbi Rabinowitz that asks, well, essentially, I'm using my own language for this. This was written in 2003 language that we don't really use anymore. So I'm going to assume what the author's intent was. The question really, to me, was, when is somebody's transition complete? So when can we call said person a man that started out assigned female at birth? And that was the only question. And their answer was progressive at the time, in that it wasn't never, because there are still communities that the answer is never. But the answer was, you need to go through all of the surgeries, all of the hormones, all of the therapy. And I want to talk a little bit about that process, because understanding what that was like for trans people and is like for trans people is really important for understanding why the 2017 teshuvah is so different. In order to get those treatments, folks had to go through like years of therapy. At every single part of that process, somebody else is deciding, well, are you really who you say you are? Like, I know you say you're a man, but are you a man? Because I need to agree with that before we can do any of this. So you had to do all of this process, and it's literally like tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars, because what they're asking is for every possible surgery. So, and thank you, Abi, for putting that in. So it's teshuvah, yes. So they have to go through every single step of all of this, thousands of dollars, and like, so that's just like the baseline. This is a really difficult process. But adding the other layer of what discrimination looks like against trans people in healthcare. So as Rabbi Roly briefly mentioned, we recently had healthcare equality really revoked. It is completely legal right now to discriminate against trans people in healthcare. So in 2020, we have people waking up with a persistent cough and a fever thinking, well, do I really need to go to the doctor? Is it worth it? Is it gonna help? Or do I just stay home? And that's like a pretty basic healthcare need of like going to the doctor, let alone finding an affirming therapist, a hormone specialist, multiple plastic surgeons. So like, I'm really laying this out of like, this was, even in 2020, an arduous thing. And this is required in 2003. So while well-intentioned, nobody was really ever going to beat that standard. And also, most trans people don't want to have all those surgeries for a lot of reasons. Just not of interest. Surgeries aren't like up to what they want yet. Various reasons. So that's where we're starting from. Of just, we have set the bar so high that nobody really can attain it. 2017, the main change that happens here in this beautiful teshuvah, that it is my favorite teshuvah that I use the most often, is that you are your gender when you say what your gender is. So what does transition look like under the teshuvah? It looks like saying, hi, my name is Michael. My pronouns are he and him. Mazel tov, you are now a man. Congrats. So like that simple. And just having that level of like autonomy and trust on who you are as a person is really, in the trans community, almost unheard of. Because again, our process is going to a therapist and proving to said therapist who we are. So the idea that we can go to a rabbi or a community and say, I am this person and these are my pronouns, and like that should be respected, is just amazing. And that's really what all of the rest of the decisions rely on. So when you look at the decisions, they are in a lot of ways assuming somebody that has not had the full array of surgeries. So starting from the less controversial, this teshuvah in total addresses 15 questions, I believe, if I remember correctly. We're not going to go through all 15 questions. They're all important questions. And there's probably more that could be asked, but I'm going to focus right now actually on marriage and divorce and Brit Milah. So, and Brit Milah meaning circumcision. So for marriage and divorce, prior to this, and in many communities, a lot of people held that when a partner that was married to somebody transitioned, the marriage is dissolved. It was not taken under good faith. This person, was marrying a man, but actually this person is now a woman, so marriage gone. Which not really a great policy, not helpful for really anybody involved. And it really does kind of assume that that's what you want, that you want the marriage to be done. So this teshuvah, there is no automatic divorce. You are still married unless you choose to be divorced, and then you go through the process. And for those not as familiar with the divorce, the challenge then presents, currently under our divorce system, a man has to agree to a get. Well, what if the person that started out as a man in the relationship is not a man in the relationship? Who is giving the get here? So the way that Rabbi Sharzer handles this is that this is done based on who would have been the original get giver. So the partner that came into the relationship assumed to be the man is the one that gives the get. So you could have a situation where a man is receiving a get, meaning somebody that was originally, it's getting really complicated to sort of the original. So you could have a situation where a woman is giving a get. That is really kind of how marriage and divorce works here. And folks that are getting married under the system, like that started out trans, before the marriage, they are treated as their, gender. Like very, very important. So that's the first really kind of not controversial, but also still very important, because this is really upholding that like trans people are in relationships, and like the automatic goal is not divorce. That some people want to still be in relationships even after transition. The more controversial part is the treatment of Brit Milah and circumcision. So this is starting from a perspective of essentially a trans person comes to you wanting to convert. Who needs to have a Brit Milah, or who needs to have a Hatafat Dam? So Brit Milah being the full circumcision, Hatafat Dam being a ritual equivalent. And there's all kinds of different ways that one can go about this. The way this teshuvah goes about it is really you take gender and you take body, and these are two separate things. So yes, you have a woman and she has a penis. She needs to have a Brit Milah. And in this teshuvah, those are not seen as conflicting at all. He actually, Rabbi Sharzer, as a doctor, uses the example of somebody that was born with, a cervix, going to a doctor and having to go through a cervical examination as one needs to, and still being treated as whatever their identified gender is, even including if that is a man. Like the fact that you need a pap smear does not make you not a man. That's really the perspective that we're taking here on gender and body. And to me, including like I am non-binary identified, this is like my favorite part of the teshuvah. Well, my second favorite part is really the your gender, but because while this teshuvah starts from a like openly acknowledges that this is more addressed toward binary folks, and like part of that is the limitation of halakha, so it doesn't shy away from that. The way that body and gender is handled there actually allows for the inclusion of non-binary people. So instead of saying, okay, there's this non-binary person, well, which gender we put them in? You say, well, their anatomy is this, so we do Brit Milah, or we don't do one. It makes it in some ways very simple, and can be really affirming. So I personally appreciate that. I appreciate that this teshuvah can like say, yes, Michael, you are obligated in nidah, and you are still who you say you are. That does not make you a woman. I love that. And it also, a lot of people criticize it for that reason. A lot of it stems from like, that's beautiful and that's wonderful. That's just not the reality. Most people, including some trans people, cannot sit face to face with another trans person discussing body parts that don't align with that person, don't align with that person's gender presentation and identity, while still seeing that person as their gender identity. So for folks, this is primarily coming from, the trans feminine community, and I certainly cannot speak on behalf of them. From what I understand, it is really hard for a trans woman to be going to a conservative rabbi to say, hey, I would like to convert, and being told, well, yes, based on your anatomy, you need to have a brit milah. Compassionately done, that's hard. It's still hard to hear. And I think most rabbis, unfortunately, don't have the skill yet to be able to do that compassionately. So I think that's where a lot of the criticism comes from, as well as some people see brit milah as inherently gendered. So it's not about, for them, so this ruling here is that brit milah is about anatomy. It is about penis and foreskin. For folks that are critical, it is actually about identity. So this is a thing that men do. So for them, it is invalidating to be asking a trans woman to be undergoing brit milah, because she is not a man. That's not what, women do not do this. And by the same token, some trans men feel invalidated that they are not required to undergo brit milah. So that is some of the main critique of this teshuvah. It really does break down to, is this a body-based mitzvah, or is this a gender identity-based mitzvah? And this holds by body, and I personally appreciate that, but some people don't as much. So that's ultimately kind of where this teshuvah kind of really lands. And the real challenge, like I've noted, is in the hands of somebody that knows a lot, knows like a decent amount about trans folks. This can so compassionately be done. I very much think that a rabbi could, like even a cishet rabbi could very compassionately explain some of the points in this teshuvah and make rulings from this teshuvah in a way that's supportive and affirming and wonderful. I've had a little bit of that for myself, so I'm going to ask a little bit about my own stuff later, but I interacted with teshuvah when I was going to rabbinical school. I had converted, and very quickly it was noticed that there was no brit milah certificate in my conversion documentation. So that kind of quickly had to get resolved because I'd had a reform conversion. So the question became, and this was post 2017, thank God, so we had an answer. Did I need to go through brit milah or hatzafat dam? So my introduction to JTS was, Michael, what do we do about your conversion, and where does it fit with this teshuvah, and what do you want to do? So from my experience with that, like, it actually was in some ways affirming. Like, I had people kindly asking important, even though difficult, awkward questions, in a way that didn't nullify my Jewishness, because this was asking for a reform conversion to become a conservative one. So that's tricky in of itself, and like didn't invalidate my gender identity, and rely heavily on the teshuvah. That being said, that doesn't fit most rabbis. We don't get enough training on that, and doesn't always fit the community. So that's really the challenge. Is like, this is, to me, beautiful and idealistic. Even with its challenges, it is like light years ahead of the 2003 teshuvah, and yet a lot of people need work to like make this really happen. So that's my brief, in a nutshell, 2003 to 2020 on transgender Jews and halakha.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. It was a great overview of both 2003 and 2017. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Rabbi Sharzer. I just want to add, when I first heard about this teshuvah, when it was being discussed in the law committee at JTS, I heard it presented by Rabbi Micah Buck-Yael, who's one of the consultants on the teshuvah. And what Rabbi Micah said, it sticks with me so much, which is that Judaism, and I said this a little bit in the advertisement for this program, which is that Judaism is based on binaries in a lot of ways, right? There's male and there's female, there's day and there's night, there's Chag and there's not Chag, there's Shabbat and there's Chol, right? There's all these binaries that sort of define what it means to be Jewish, according to Jewish law. But immediately you have the rabbis wrestling with things like twilight, right? Ben hashmashot, this in-between time that's neither day nor night. And suddenly they're thrown into this confusion. Well, what do we do about ben hashmashot? How do we handle that? And I feel like it's really in the way that the rabbis handle those gray areas that we learn how to handle gray areas in other binaries. And given that, many cultures have understood this for a long time, American culture is starting to understand that that when it comes to gender, there are gray areas. I think that we can look to the ways that rabbis have approached some of these questions. So now I want to invite to join us in the conversation. We're very lucky at the BJ community to have, as a member of our community, the author of the teshuvah, of the legal responsum that Michael described, the 2017 one. And he so graciously was willing to join us tonight to talk about it. So Rabbi Sharzer is the Associate Director Emeritus of the Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary. For many years, Rabbi Sharzer served as a clinical professor at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine at Yeshiva University. He retired from medical practice in 1999 to enter the rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was ordained in May of 2003. In addition to his publications in medical literature, he's the author of 2 responsa of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly. The first is Organ Donation After Cardiac Death, and most recently, the teshuvah under discussion, Transgender Jews and Halakha. In addition, he contributed an essay on religious attitudes toward gender-confirming surgery to a forthcoming plastic surgery textbook, and co-edited The Changing Face of the American Jewish Family, which came out last November. We're so excited to bring Rabbi Sharzer into the conversation. Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a few questions of both Michael and of Rabbi Sharzer. Hopefully we'll have some discussion between the two as well. And I'll invite you, if you have questions of your own, already if you have questions, things you're curious about, things you're wondering about, I would say as long as it's asked in a respectful manner, please ask. The way to do that is to chat Diana Tamir. She's going to be fielding the questions tonight. So if you look in your chat, you should have the option to send a private chat to any of the co-hosts. Send all of your questions to Diana Tamir, and we'll have some time at the end to answer questions from the audience. So if you have questions for either of the panelists. So I wanted to start off by asking Rabbi Sharzer to talk a little bit about the process that led to the teshuvah that we've been discussing. So what prompted you to write this?
Well, thank you very much, Abi, for putting this together. Thank you very much, Michael, for that beautiful presentation. I have to tell you that to hear a current rabbinical student who has studied this and devoted so much of his own time and effort and intellect to it and presented so beautifully is gratifying beyond what words can express. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted, Michael, to hear you talk about the teshuvah. You mentioned, Abi, that I finished the rabbinical school at JTS in 2003, which was the same time Rabbi Rabinowitz was writing his teshuvah, and I had him as my teacher for the senior course in Halakha while he was working on it. And because I had done some work in gender confirming surgery during my medical residency, I had some thoughts to offer him in the teshuvah that he was writing. And with all that, I ended up writing a senior paper about the issue and about the areas where I disagreed with some of his positions. That paper never had any formal presentation anywhere. It never went to the law committee, but it kind of developed a life on the underground internet. That is, a lot of people knew I had written it, and I would send a copy to someone who would send a copy to someone else who was interested in the subject. So it kind of made a lot of rounds over those next few years, even though it was unpublished and in a very unofficial way. And then I would say along around 2012, 2013 or so, when the whole, when we in the Jewish world and in our broader society started to recognize trans people and understand some of the questions that needed to be answered, Rabbi Dorf, who was by then chair of the law committee, asked me if I would bring that 2003 paper that I had written up to date. Well, things had changed so much that it couldn't be brought up to date. It had to be totally rewritten. But this was a time, and because Rabbi Dorf knew that I had done this work and was still interested in the subject, when he would, from time to time, get calls from other rabbis, he would refer them to me. So I was getting maybe 2 to 3 calls a month. I have a trans congregant or a trans person who has been in my Intro to Judaism class and wants to convert, and there are these issues. Or we're going to do a tefillah, a visit to the mikveh for a trans person who's converting. Who should be witnessing this? Or I have a trans congregant who died. Who should be doing the tahara? So these were actual questions that were coming up, and they were coming up with ever increasing frequency. So I think that prompted Rabbi Dorf to ask me to update or rewrite the teshuvah, and just a statement as to how much more, I would say, much more immediate the whole question is that, I had 2 students in my classes. One was Rabbi Bakyael, who transitioned right after graduation. I had 5 rabbinic colleagues who had trans children. There were people in my circle that I knew about who had a relative, knew somebody, themselves were transitioning. So it was becoming an issue where there were questions that really needed answers, and they needed answers with some immediacy. And I was really very fortunate that people like Rabbi Bakyael, Rabbi Roly Matalon in Washington or Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, who was also one of my students, Joy Layden, who many of you know, who teaches at Stern College, Professor Aaron DeVore, who holds a chair in transgender studies in Vancouver, were all willing to read this and consult and give me feedback and point me in directions that I needed to go. So, there was all that advice and help available to me, and that's how it came about.
Nice, thank you. I think one of the things that you just touched on, which really impresses me about your work, and also when you and Rabbi Bak Yael presented at JTS a few years ago, is there's a lot of talk about allyship and what that means. And one of the things, you know, in general, I will say being an ally, as it's usually construed, is working with, listening to, supporting a marginalized community of which you are not a part, right? So an identity that you do not hold. And it's a complicated thing to be an ally. And I was very impressed. Often I think that, I'm trying to think of a nicer way to say this. There are many older cisgendered men who work at JTS. There are many older cisgendered rabbis. That was the only people who could be rabbis for a long time. And not all of them are great at being allies. And so I just wanted to point out that, that folks sometimes get a pass because of generation or of their own identity. And I really feel like you stepped into this role of an ally and really engaged with the issues so deeply. And I think that's really impressive. So I wanted to say, throw it back to Michael, to say, what do you see as the role of an ally for someone who's not trans, who's not part of the trans community, but who's part of the Jewish community? What is their role?
Had many things to say and think about this in the last few weeks, as you've seen probably on my Facebook. But I think the main thing really is we are doing a lot of hopefully all of us are doing a lot of anti-racist work right now and familiar with the idea of white fragility. I mean, there is an equivalent cis fragility, and really the meaning that a lot of cis people, understandably, are attached to the idea of being a good ally and have a really hard time hearing it when a trans person says, yeah, but you did this thing and it really hurt. So really the most central thing for me is being a cis person that is willing and able to hear when you've hurt somebody, and doing what you can to fix it. And to the best of your ability, not doing it again. To me, if you can't do that, you're not a good ally, whatever else you do. You could be I don't know, founding all kinds of foundations and giving every trans person $1 million a year, and you'd still not be a great ally, because that is the most essential part of it to me, is because I've had so many interactions with cis people or say, you know, this thing that you did was not great, and it becomes this uncomfortable, awful confrontation. So for me, that's the main thing. And then just being willing to take people for who they say they are. As I noted, the entire transition process until very recently, and even still now, is proving who you are to somebody else. Don't be one of those people. When somebody says my name is such and such and my pronouns are such and such, learn it, use them. There's not really, yes, there's an adjustment, and that adjustment should not be eternal. And with that too, mistakes happen, not sitting there and chastising yourself about how awful you are, because then our impulse is to say, no, it was okay, it's not that bad, which is not the space we should be in. It's just, I'm sorry I messed up, I'm going to do better, and then doing better. Those to me are the really core components of it, because I feel probably most people, if they are here right now, don't need to hear stop hating trans people actively. They probably don't need to hear that as much, but doing those core things, and when you can, educating yourself in a way that doesn't put the onus entirely on a trans person. I definitely have relationships where I am super happy to explain to a really close person I have what my gender status is right now. So happy to do that. And I know that if I said, hey, I don't really want to do that, can you read this book? They'll do it. So be one of those people that if your friend is no, I can't explain this anymore, that you do it yourself too. I think that's the core for me.
Nice, thanks. So I'm curious, Rabbi Sharzer, both, in the process, you spoke a little bit about your own experiences as a surgeon, and then your experiences with people in your community and other rabbinic colleagues working on this. I'm curious about both in the process of writing it and in the response to it, how you sort of dealt with various interactions with trans folks. Have there been areas of contention, and how have you responded to that?
Like any community, the trans community is not monolithic, just like the Jewish community is not. And there are people who hold different views, sometimes very strongly. I remember in the early drafts of the writing, and I don't remember which order it was, but say in one draft, I would write trans man or trans woman as a single word. And then people reviewed it and said, no, that's not the way. It should be two separate words. And then so I revised the draft, made it two separate words. Then there are others who criticized it and said, no, it should be a single word. And I will never forget a conversation that I had with Professor DeVore. And I said, I don't know what to do. Maybe I should half the time spell it one way, half the time spell it the other way. And he said, it doesn't matter what you do or how you spell it, somebody will be mad at you. So there are things that people just don't agree on. I remember, I think it was at Town and Village Synagogue, I was giving a talk, and before the talk, someone in the, I don't know if it was a member of the congregation or just coming for the talk, came up to me and said, you know, you should make it clear that non-binary people are not transgender. Because he was trans and, you know, a trans man, he, him, his, totally. And he said, you know, it's wrong to include non-binary people in the, you know, under the transgender umbrella, which is not what most people say. So there's different opinions that, and you have to be, you know, polite and acknowledge it. And then, you know, you have to make a decision somewhere. Probably the biggest area of contention, as Michael mentioned, I don't know if this is the appropriate time to talk about it, is the issue of conversion of trans women and the question of Brit Milah or Hatafat Dam Brit. And I will say that writing the paper, I knew that this would be a difficult area. Talking with all the consultants that I had worked with, it was clear that this would be a difficult area. And I will just say that I didn't know another way to deal with it. But, you know, a rabbinic responsum is not Torah Misinai. It's someone's opinion at a time. And, you know, especially now that we have people like Michael, who God willing will be a rabbi soon, and Micah Bakyael and others who will pick up the ball and be able to move it forward. I mean, I don't have to say this because we all know, but when the law committee decided to ordain women, it was only men on the law committee. When the law committee decided to ordain people who were openly gay, there were only straight people on the committee. And there were no trans rabbis on the committee when this teshuvah was decided. Once we open things up, we get much better input. I fully recognize the difficulty, the personal difficulty that this causes some people. And, but deciding differently would have left me unable to answer certain questions in a way that I thought had halakhic integrity, like what to do about a non-binary person, what they require, and then what about a cisgender man who just doesn't want to have Brit Milah but wants to convert? How we talk to parents who have a newborn baby who is assigned male at birth, who says, no, we don't want to do a Brit Milah at 8 days. We want to wait to find out what gender this baby identifies as. So it opened more problems that I didn't know how to answer. I hope in the future there will be people coming along who are able to answer that question maybe differently.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, and the sort of different possibilities that come out of it that a person may not think of right away. And I love the way that Michael described it, of if you're a trans man, you may still, need to have a pap smear. It's about the anatomy, not necessarily about the gender identity. I wanted to shift gears a little bit, and actually something that Rabbi Sharzer mentioned was just the idea that when women began to be ordained at JTS, there were no women on the law committee. And I wanted to address this question to Michael. So when I first heard you speak about the teshuvah and your approach to it, I remember commenting that some of the conversation that comes about in this teshuvah, I felt like really began with Jewish feminism, which argued with the traditional Jewish idea that male anatomy is necessary for most ritual leadership roles, right? In order to be a rabbi, you have to be male. In order to count in a minyan, you have to be male. So when female-bodied people began to be counted in a minyan in the conservative movement, and then when they began to be ordained as rabbis at JTS, many people saw them as, in a way, becoming spiritual men, right? Taking on traditional male gender roles in order to fully embody Jewish leadership. And then since then, some Jewish feminists have objected to this approach, arguing for a more inclusive Judaism that acknowledges Jewish femininity in leadership as well. So I'm curious in general how you would respond to the comparison of the Jewish feminist movement to the contemporary conversation about trans rights and roles in Judaism. So that's for Michael.
Okay, so this is an excellent question. The way I conceptualize it, and given my little bio of I don't write theology because that's really modest to say, but is that how I see a lot of how feminism kind of started is, look, everything that we're doing Jewish assumes that we are men, and we've made rabbis that are women, but they have to pretend to be men essentially. That's a problem, so let's bring in femininity, which is great. And also still is binary, in that now we do have the masculinity still, but now we have the femininity, but they're still kind of separate. Where I see kind of the next step, and this is where the larger trans movement comes in, is just like, what if we all just like did stuff and it wasn't really affiliated with the gender, it's just we did a thing. Like, why does caring for a sick person have to be gendered? Why does this tickle have to be gendered? It's kind of where I see that coming in. That's kind of where some of the dispute is with femininity and the trans community, is the feminism and the trans community. Thankfully, only a very small subset of the feminism community, but of just this, like, that's where I want things to go, of just complete liberation from gender, really. And if you still feel affiliated with the gender, like, fabulous, embrace it, but like, we should not all have to be put into gender boxes. And I want to like reclaim Judaism and a God that is able to do all of the things. And if you say, no, I really don't want to wear dresses, fabulous, don't. But like, it is an option that you have when you don't have that when it's so binary gendered. So that's where I see that kind of going, but it is part of that larger progression. Had women not been ordained, we would not be having this conversation. Because I guarantee, like in the Orthodox circles where they're talking about queer equality, a lot of them are saying, well, like, what if we like let women also have some rights? Maybe we can do that first or instead. Which is so fascinating to see that there are some communities in which they would rather like make it egalitarian than count a trans man as a man. So it's fascinating to see that. So from my perspective, if we had not had that, we would not have trans people in, like, if we had not had female rabbis, just female rabbis, we would not have gay and lesbian rabbis, and we definitely would not have trans rabbis. It really is all a large progression.
Mm-hmm. Nice, thanks. And then I guess the same question for Rabbi Sharzer in terms of sort of did you look to the history of what the law committee had spoken about in terms of egalitarianism and the logic that was used, and were there particular models of that you looked to in your teshuvah?
I have to say, not really. You know, I mean, some of it I had lived through, so it was like there in the background. I didn't specifically study any of the teshuvot from that time. You know, the teshuvot about ordaining gay rabbis and cantors, that was while I was in rabbinical school already. So I was obviously, you know, very aware of what was being done there. And I would say that that made an impression on me in the sense that it was very strong about the need to recognize the dignity of every person. And exactly how we do that and how close we come to that ideal, that's a different question. But the idea that kvod habriot, that every person is in the image of the divine, however we want to think of that, and should be treated with respect and dignity, and that then formed the underlying fundamental value that I then had to try and work out a halakhic way, or say it a little differently, work out a way to overcome the halakhic obstacles to that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And then I'm curious, this is also for Rabbi Sharzer, and then I'll ask Michael as well. So it's been 3 years since this was officially passed in the law committee. I guess I'll just mention B'nai Jeshurun as a community is unaffiliated, but often looks to the law committee for guidance on many issues. And there are, you know, many congregations that are affiliated with the conservative movement that look to the law committee and its decisions for guidance. So I'm curious about what changes you've seen since it passed. You know, you mentioned that you go out and you do, you know, you teach at different communities. How have things been different in the last 3 years? And how has that been affected just by broader society and what's changing in the world?
Well, one thing is that I get many fewer questions from rabbis because they have a place to look at it. So there aren't people calling, what do I do with this situation? What do I do with that situation? And rabbis want their congregants to understand what the issues are and how the Jewish community writ large and the conservative Jewish community in particular are dealing with those issues. And I would say a question that has started to come up, which was not addressed in the teshuvah, relates to one of the points that Michael made at the beginning of his presentation, and that is about the language of certificates, like conversion certificates. What do we write if, there is no Brit Milah or Hatafat Dam for a convert in whom you would expect to see it mentioned in the conversion certificate, or vice versa, or if it's not required, why it's not required, those kind of things. So how do we rewrite traditional certificates which people may have to show, and how do we take into account that some trans people may be activists, and the fact that they're trans is a very key part of their identity, and there are others who want to have just transitioned and be recognized solely as the new gender and don't want anything on a certificate necessarily saying they're trans. So how do we do this to accommodate everybody's needs?
I think that's a great question. I haven't come up with an answer yet, but maybe, I don't know if Michael has one, or we'll keep working on it.
So I don't have a full answer, but this is something that I had to deal with because I had to have a conservative redo. And I am somebody that, again, JTS partially figured out that I was trans. So they're like, we have this conversion certificate and there's no Brit Milah. Explain. So I had originally wanted to have basically an addendum that said Michael Faccini did not, Brit Milah was not required. Period. End of subject. Very discreet, stealth kind of. No one would ever know why. And had a conversation with my rabbi about it, because I told him that, and he's like, well, but why do you want to do that? And what we eventually settled on is it's an addendum. It's not in the actual form itself, because it's like you have many editing privileges there, but that says Michael Faccini did not have Brit Milah. It was not required because he's a transgender man. Like, now that like the language would probably be a little bit changed now, but like still reflects that basically this was not required because trans. And while I was initially kind of hesitant or resistant to it, I actually am really grateful that I did that. And like, yes, I'm activist and whatever, but like part of it is very few people actually ever see these documents. So it felt important to own it enough that like I can be okay with somebody that is gonna like, I don't know, like officiate a wedding, God willing, seeing this conversion document, and not feeling like I have to hide that fact. And it felt like a reclaiming, because we talk about like the experience of a trans person. It's easier in some ways to use the trans woman example because it's in a lot of ways simple. Like, talk about the power of a trans woman being able to have a discussion about Brit Milah and still being seen and viewed and treated as a woman. There is also power to acknowledging that you are trans and that you are still a man, and that, yeah, you don't have to have a Brit Milah, but like you are so all of those things and like that entirety of a human being. So that probably should not be like the default solution, but that's how we solved it, and I certainly did not come up with that solution, but I'm very grateful that I did. So that's the answer to that question. But to the original question about changes since then, the main change, and this is like an adorable story. So I had just started to get to know my home shul, when the teshuvah came out, I actually learned teshuvah from Rabbi Michael Faccini. Learned this from him, and when I, at that point, was presenting much more typically masculine, most people assumed that I was cis. Probably assumed that I was gay, but like definitely assumed I was cis. And I didn't feel super comfortable in the congregation clarifying that fact. Kind of let it roll. So that's 2017, like, yeah, let's just pretend that I'm cis and like we're not going to talk about it. And then not long after, like that, the following year, 2018, I did the Devar for Pride Shabbat, said I was queer, didn't say I was trans, didn't feel comfortable. And we had a non-binary member that started coming more often and was more prominent in the community. So that kind of discussion started coming in. So I started being more open about being trans, and like things started getting a little bit better. And then I came to New York, and when I moved to New York, it became more non-binary in my presentation and identity, and was like, oh no, I'm going home to visit for, see my rabbi, and they're seeing me in like pants and a button up and very binary, and most of them don't know I'm trans. Oh no, this is really scary and bad. Went, wore a dress, nobody blinked an eye. So that, to me, I can't say that that is from the teshuvah. Like, I don't think people are like, well, question 4 is really compelling. So I decided, but it happened in those 3 years, and that to me is just astounding. That like went from like I don't really feel super comfortable being trans in this community to I am very visibly and obviously trans, and like nobody cares in a good way. Like that's to me just, I don't know. Like 2020 is a tire fire. It just won't stop burning, but like that's also part of 2020 for me.
Thank you. 2020 is hard in a lot of ways, and also it's good to hear about the progress of the last 3 years and of the last 17 years, and hopefully continuing progress in the Supreme Court and beyond. I want to take a moment to take questions. So the way to ask a question is to send it to Diana Tamir. In the chat, you can send a private message to Diana Tamir, and she will send some of the questions over to me. So one of the questions that's come up so far is, in terms of halakha, what do you think, what work still needs to be done for trans rights? Are there things that can be done at the level of halakha that still need to be addressed? You mentioned the certificate issue. I don't know if there are others.
Are you asking me?
Either of you, if you'd like, if you can think of anything that you wanted to.
I think, so I don't know for sure how much this changes halakha, but we do need to come up with a better solution for trans women. Whether that is we solve it by training all the rabbis to be like fantastic and awesome and like really humanizing and talking about it, or
the issue of requiring trans women to undergo brit milah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Training rabbis to have those conversations in
so whether it's that or we come up with some kind of halakhic innovation, I also, similar to Rabbi Sharzer, do not know what that solution is, but we do need to find some kind of solution that is going to make that less painful. I think we do obviously need to better address the needs of non-binary folks, because we are part of the trans community, and yes, there is contention within the trans community about that, but there does need to be work around that, and many associated questions that come with non-binary issues. I'm sure there's also stuff around parenting, because teshuvah does discuss trans masculine folks that get pregnant, but there's got to be some halakhic questioning around like the mother of the child has a penis. Like what you know, like all of those kind of questions, like who does the child inherit Jewish status from? Like, how does all of that work? Like, I can't really name all of them. I'm sure that, like, especially when it comes to like family creation, family structures, there's got to be questions that haven't been answered yet. More generally than that. I mean, I think this is something that I always find a little lacking generally, at least with these subject areas to vote, is we don't really hold the communities to a super high standard. They can opt out of all of this. So I wish that we had something of like, because there is a little bit of teeth in that with the 2006 gay and lesbian teshuvah of like, treating gays and lesbians poorly is bringing shame upon yourself. There's some kind of like, this is bad for the community too. And I wish we worked something more in like that, some kind of like, communities should be doing these things. Because right now you can totally be super transphobic as a rabbi in community and like, that's fine. Mm-hmm. Obviously it's not, but like, there's no real recourse. You can just say, well, we don't hold that at teshuvah, so.
Right, and that's the concept of mara da'atra, of the local authority, right? Your local rabbi is ultimately your authority on halakhic issues, which there was another question that has to do with that issue. But first, I'll ask Rabbi Sharzer if you know of anything right now that you think still needs to be addressed.
Well, I think for one, we should recognize that many of the questions, many of the situations, many of the issues are not necessarily halakhic ones. So, you know, like talking about parenting and mother and father and definitions and all that, that families have to work that out. Ways, you know, dealing with children in Hebrew schools who may be trans, but we have to work on that. We have to do those things better, but for the most part, they don't raise halakhic questions. You know, the new building at JTS is a dormitory that had to be, or I assume will be, among other things, trans-friendly. But that's not a halakhic question. So what is coming up that is halakhic? Michael mentioned this sticky area about Brit Milah and trans women. And I wonder if there is an argument. I'm not ready to make it. Let me just say that because I haven't looked at it. But if there might be a way to make an argument that hatafat dam brit is not required for conversion for anybody, cis, trans, anybody. And since something like what, 85% of babies born assigned male in this country are circumcised, and if you could make a case that hatafat dam was not necessary, for the vast majority of people, you have eliminated the question. So I don't know if that'll work. I don't know if that argument could be made coherently, but we have to come up with different strategies, different kinds of questions to see if they can get us where we want to go. And I don't know what the answer will be to that.
Nice. That's really interesting. It sort of changes the approach. It's not so much about trans people in particular, but why is this ceremony required? Is really interesting. I want to pick up also on something that came up a little with what Michael was talking about. Someone was wondering usually in the law committee, when there's a teshuvah on an issue, particularly on a controversial issue of some sort, there are alternative and even conflicting teshuvot on the same subject. And the way that the structure works in the rabbinical assembly is that multiple conflicting teshuvot can actually both pass and hold the same level of authority. That is how it works. And then it's up to the Mara Da'atra, the local authority, to make a decision for their own community. This person noted that there wasn't a conflicting teshuvah in 2017. So why is that the case? Why wasn't there someone who said, no, it should be a different way? And did you deal with any of that in your personal conversation in writing this, Rabbi Sharzer?
Why there was no dissenting opinion, I don't know. Nobody wrote one. In developing the teshuvah, I certainly had many conversations about the questions that I was writing about, and got a lot of input. And it was presented to the law committee, at least 2 times. I think it was 2 times, at which everybody on the law committee got to ask questions, make suggestions, offer things, and some of them were things that I felt I could incorporate, and others were not.
Mm-hmm. And one question, I'm actually not sure if the teshuvah addresses this, so either Michael or Rabbi Sharzer, in the situation specifically about parenting, if a trans man gives birth to a baby, is the baby considered Jewish by birth, given that it was a Jewish father in that situation?
If the person who gives birth is Jewish, the baby's Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
That's, it is not, the question, I had not heard it raised in regard to a trans man giving birth. It certainly comes up in the area of surrogacy. In other words, if whether a baby born through surrogacy is Jewish or not depends, at least according to current halakha, solely on the surrogate who actually carries and delivers the baby, not on the egg donor, not on the mother who will be the social mother, because they may be 3 different people, they may be 2 different people, but right now that it depends on the Jewish status of the person who carries and delivers the baby. So that baby would be Jewish.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it actually hadn't occurred to me. We talk a lot about matrilineal and patrilineal descent, but perhaps we need to change that language to say things like descent through the birthing parent, which is something that hadn't occurred to me before. It's very interesting. Thank you. This is kind of a radical question. This will be our last one before we close out in a few minutes. Someone is wondering, it seems that a lot of gender is constructed to support laws of exclusion. You can do this and you can't do, and you can do this, but you can't. So why not just remove gender as a category from halakha altogether? So I guess I'll hear from Michael on this question, and then if you have anything to add, Rabbi Sharzer.
I fully endorse this plan. I mean, like, practically what that looks like, yeah, that's going to be super difficult because, wow, is halakha gendered. But again, like, I personally don't think, like, I'm not really into gender. as somebody that has many gender presentations, I'm like not into gender. I don't think that it should be a defining feature of like really anything. Like, so I'm totally cool with us finding a way to make halakha less binary in general, and particularly when it comes to gender. And noting, because I do remember like a lot of feminist critique of early attempts to de-gender Judaism, doing this in a way that doesn't just make this, we have no gender, but actually that gender is this het man. Doing this in a way that's just like, we have no gender, like you can be all kinds of different genders, and that's not a bad thing at all. And you don't have to, you know, there is no way in which you are included or excluded in something based on gender. So, for example, like Brit law could still exist in that. That is anatomy based. That's not gender based. Same with Nidat. Like there are ways to actually work this back in, where it doesn't have to be all of this. You know, there was a lot of twisting around and wrangling and trying to figure out how to make it work for women to be ordained. When like if you just said like gender's not really a thing we care about, it's not a problem. Like so much, in some ways, so much an easier solution, and also requires quite a radical overhaul of halakha. So if I get out of rabbinical school for having said that, I guess that's on me, not on the person that asked the question, but fully support that.
Thank you for that. I think I just want to say one note, and I remember some of the folks in the BJ community were at a program last summer when we watched Gender Revolution, which is a Katie Couric documentary, and I just remember there was a memorable scene where the tennis player Renee Richards, who was sort of one of the pioneers of trans activism, she's in conversation with a much younger trans activist, and Renee is arguing, no, my transition was all about binary. I was assigned male at birth, and I knew I was a woman, and I wanted to become a woman, and I want to play tennis as a woman, and she did. And she said, my transition was about moving from one side of the binary to the other side of the binary. That was the trans piece of it. And then this younger person was basically saying, no, I remember that specifically they said, I want a gender chill future. Let's just all chill and be okay with like lots of ambiguity on this issue, and let go of the idea that you need to be in one box or the other. And I think both of those exist. Some of it's generational, but not all of it is. So Rabbi Sharzer, any thoughts on the idea of ridding halakha of gender-based anything altogether? And also just any closing thoughts you have before we close in a few minutes.
I'll say a couple of things. One, it's like sculpting a stone statue. You just gotta chip away at the stuff that doesn't belong. Oh, women can't count an minion. Chip that away. Women can't get an aliyah. Chip that away. Women can't be a rabbi. Chip that away. Gays can't be a rabbi. Chip that. So you just go. I know sometimes it's a little out of fashion to want to go stepwise and slow these days, but sometimes things just happen stepwise. And the other thing, the final thing I would say, and comes from being a very senior person. I'm just reminded of the saying of Rabbi Tarfon in Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. You don't have to finish the job, but neither can you desist from moving it forward. So we come along, you know, if we can move the ball down the field, maybe make a first down, somebody else will come along and get it across the goal line. But, you know, we each do what we can while we're here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Sharzer. Michael, any final thoughts on this teshuvah, on your experience in the Jewish community? Oh yeah, I guess one last chance to say to the folks of BJ who are still here at this late hour, what you wish folks would know about your experience.
Well, that it exists, I think, is a good start for knowing my experience. But I think that really the main thing is, like, this is not a perfect teshuvah. Those do not exist. And I appreciate Rabbi Sharzer noting, which we sometimes do forget, that, like, there can be further teshuvah that change this and improve it. Like, this is not the last, final, end of the line word on it. So noting that, but, like, there is a lot of beauty in this teshuvah. There is a lot of idealism in this teshuvah. And the ways in which this teshuvah is painful right now is because we don't live up to that idealism. We don't live up to that beauty. So what I want to charge all of us to do is make a world where a trans woman can enter a rabbi's office talking about her conversion, and they can talk about whatever may need to be done. Maybe in this alternative universe, future world, like, Brit Milah is no longer required in that situation, but, like, where they can have that conversation and her status and identity as a woman is not challenged at all, and this person can look at her and see her in her entirety. Because, like, what we all want as human beings is to be seen, heard, understood, and loved in our entirety as who we are. And I gotta say, it doesn't happen often for trans folks. So let's fix that.
All right. Thank you so much. That's a great message to end on, to see people in their entirety and with love and compassion. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Rabbi Sharzer. Thank you to Shuli for doing the Zoom admin, to Diana for doing the Q&A, to Roly for the introduction, to all of you for coming and for listening and continuing to learn. A couple of announcements. We have many, many wonderful upcoming programs at B'nai Jeshurun, as we always do. First off, a continuation of Pride Month for the next week. This Wednesday, we continue our series of LGBTQ stories at Minyan. So if you stick around Morning Minyan, you'll hear from one of our members about their experience. And let's see, we have an ongoing program where you can postcard or phone bank with Reclaim Our Vote. If you're interested in that, that's specifically around the fact that there's a lot of voter suppression that's been happening and people who have been coming off of the voter rolls. So dealing with that issue. This Thursday, there's going to be a really interesting program with an organization called Bat-Kol, that is a queer religious women's organization in Israel. It's sort of a very quiet and mysterious organization in some ways because they're really careful, because a lot of the women who are in that group are not out in their religious, sometimes ultra-Orthodox communities. We have Pride Havdalah this Saturday night, and then on Sunday, BJ is one of the co-sponsors of Jew York Pride. So all of that is on our website, bj.org. Check it out. And thank you all for joining, and have a great night. Take care.